This is Owen Gaffney. He writes about big picture narratives of the past and future of people on Earth and co-founded the Future Earth Media Lab, which aims to connect people, science and the planet for a sustainable future.
Great to have you here, back on stage here in Stockholm. Owen, we're all ears. Your presentation is coming up. Thank you.
Thank you. And hi everyone. So it's Earth Week. 4.5 billion people in lockdown, 60% of the population. Wherever you are, COVID-19 has fundamentally changed how we live our lives. I want to make 3 points in this talk. First, the 2020s will see the fastest economic transition in history. Second, we need more positive visions for recovery. You know, a resilient economy within planetary boundaries is a future of prosperity and stability. And thirdly, and finally, since the 1st of January, we are in a whole new world. The pandemic changes everything. It has brought out the best in us, our humanity, our morality and solidarity, but also the worst in the markets. So first, our exponential roadmap shows it is technically feasible to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. We identified the 36 solutions that are market ready right now and that can scale rapidly, from wind and solar to food waste and circular economies. One is to replace 140 million business trips with teleconferences, and here we are. So we've got the economic logic, that's there. And now the sentiment is also there in the economy. We're getting real leadership is emerging from people like Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Also the central banks are now putting their might behind this issue. They're preparing for and helping steer a massive and rapid reallocation of capital. But elsewhere too, the mouthpieces of the free market, the Financial Times, The Economist, the World Economic Forum, are all advocating for a stable planet and greater equality. Even the world's biggest brands and the most valuable companies, Apple, H&M, IKEA, even Volkswagen, the poster child of duplicity, is joining this bandwagon. But bigger than this virtual signaling, in the last couple of years, we have reached this economic turning point, a point of no return in the climate transition. Your price is falling as innovation grows year on year. This is a classic exponential trajectory that destroys all competition. Now we have reached a critical threshold because renewables are cheaper year by year than fossil fuels. We've reached that critical threshold just in the last couple of years, where in many parts in the world they are either similar prices or cheaper. So this is a tipping point. So I'm going to outline 3 possible but provocative scenarios for how market confidence might evolve in the 2020s. So the first scenario, carbon shock. So the markets sense politicians have no appetite for strong climate policies in the face of this pandemic. Demand for fossil fuels rises, as does investment, as economies recover. But the economy has already reached a point of no return. Demand for fossil fuels slumps in the late 2020s, and the carbon bubble bursts, leaving $1 trillion in worthless mines and power stations, even with weak policy. So the second scenario, called carbon shock plus. In the second scenario, it starts like the carbon shock scenario. Politicians act very weakly, a signal to markets to continue as normal. Then in the mid-2020s, politicians have a change of heart. Perhaps public pressure becomes unbearable, or maybe we hit a cycle of climate catastrophes, floods, droughts, food shortages, fires, month on month, year on year. Or maybe the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Amazon rainforest lurch dramatically, or all of the above. So politicians double down on action to protect lives and bend the curve to make up for lost time. The market sentiment shifts forcibly away from fossil fuels, setting off a stampede. By one estimate, this could lead to a carbon bubble 4 times larger, so about $4 trillion. The losers in this scenario would be countries who clung to fossil fuels for too long: the United States, Canada, Russia, the Middle East, Australia. And the winners would be China and Europe, who are less exposed. So then the final scenario is the resilient economy within planetary boundaries. In this scenario, politicians send strong signals that will direct the pandemic recovery towards restabilizing the planet and the economy. They announce net zero by 2040 or 2050 and set targets for deforestation, zero biodiversity loss. The market responds by reallocating investments towards these long-term goals. So in all these scenarios, rapid change is inevitable, but only the final one is stabilizing. So 2020 is a really big year. If Europe agrees a Green New Deal during this crisis, if we see a US leadership change, if China's emissions peak sooner than predicted, then something like scenario 3 will become a reality. So my second point is that we need more positive visions for the future. And in 2019, at the height of the Brexit omnishambles, the UK signed into law a bill committing to net zero by 2050. Isn't it remarkable that the only non-polarizing thing political parties in the UK could agree on in 2019 was the single most dramatic transformation since the Industrial Revolution? How was it possible? Well, as Nick Robbins mentioned earlier, because the estimated cost of such a transition is just 1 to 2% of GDP. There's rounding errors. Less than the cost of Brexit, less than the cost of the pandemic. And not only that, it will bring competitiveness, it will bring jobs, it will bring long-term energy security, innovation and prosperity. Now more major economies are beginning to embrace a vision I thought was completely unthinkable just 12 months ago. But they can go faster. As Bill Gates says, we overestimate what is possible in 2 years, and we underestimate what is possible in 10. We put a man on the moon in a decade. We reduced ozone-depleting chemicals 50% in a decade. Acid rains fell across Europe 60% in a decade. In South Africa, longevity jumped 10 years in 10 years. We can halve emissions, and many companies can go much, much faster than that. So my third point is the global pandemic. This has made the unthinkable thinkable economically. Money is no object. Trillions of dollars have been found in back pockets to shore up economies, and we should applaud them. Governments might reasonably, though, place a series of conditions on bailouts. Bailouts will be paid for by future taxpayers dealing with a worsening planetary emergency. So I'd like to outline 6 proposals. And these are based on the planetary emergency stimulus strategy we've been working on with the Club of Rome and WWF and others. So first, fix the broken price signal. Price carbon. Tax the things we want less of, like pollution, and remove tax from things we want more of, like jobs. Increase carbon taxes and reduce income tax to help businesses and consumers. Stop subsidizing fossil fuels. If all fossil fuel subsidies were removed, emissions would fall about 10% by 2030. So number 2, governments might insist companies stop share buybacks and instead invest their cash in transitioning to circular business models. Number 3, air pollution is falling in cities. Instead of reducing congestion charges to encourage traffic, subsidize public transport and incentivize people to cycle or walk. Number 4, debt relief. Bail out poor borrowers. After the corona crisis, people and businesses will be plagued by high debt levels. When rich households save and poor households borrow, inequality increases and demand falls. 5, borrow money. There has never been a better time. Promote job creation through the expansion of food, health and education sectors. Build New Deal scale infrastructure projects to get people back to work. Wind, solar, electrify roads. Invest in renewable, in renovating housing stock. 6, and finally, and even better than borrowing from the rich, tax the rich. The super rich, the wealthiest 0.5% of people on Earth are responsible for the same emissions as the poorest 3.5 billion people. A global wealth tax would guarantee the future we want. But above all, redirecting markets starts with setting a target of net zero by 2050 or earlier, and a target to halve emissions by 2030. So the return on investment on a stable planet is infinite. So, thank you for your time. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Thank you very much, Owen Gaffney, for your presentation. I'd like to ask you, what has the response been so far from the world of finance in regards to the Exponential Roadmap?
So we've had, the Exponential Roadmap, first began in 2017 when we published a research paper on it, and then we published 2 reports. And the response has been fantastic, actually. I mean, when we first published the idea of halving emissions every decade, it seemed, the world was not quite ready for such a message. And now we're finding that more and more people are talking about it, and it's becoming part of the narrative, I think. There's a a sort of a greater feeling that we need to do most of the work faster. So we're getting a lot of interest, not just from the finance community, from building community, from truck companies, everything.
Great. So how do you think COVID-19 will affect the emissions?
So that is a million-dollar question right now. So it's very, very difficult to say what emissions will be like by the end of this year, given the state of the crisis right now. There have been some ballpark figures thrown about of about 4%, potentially 5% reduction in emissions in 2020. Now, last year, the Global Carbon Project put emissions in 2019 as around, the emissions growth was about stabilizing, about zero growth. So if it falls 4 or 5% this year, that would be absolutely historic. But whenever emissions have fallen deeply in the past, the Soviet Union collapse, the financial crisis, they've come roaring back again because there's been no big economic structural change. So that's the big issue here, that we could end up actually going back on the same trajectory we've been on before, unless this kickstarts something completely new.
Which really needs to happen.
Yeah.
Nick Nuttall, what questions do we have from the viewers?
Yes, Katarina. As you know, when I do the questions, I have to plug my mobile phone into a very strange thing. I feel like I've got a dog at the other end. So, Owen, there is a question for you. And the question is, which scenario do you think is the most realistic of all the ones you've seen?
Well, so that's a good question. A year or two ago, I would have been pessimistic about things. Now I'm more optimistic that we'll have the scenario 3, because the European Union is talking about net zero by 2050. I don't think this is just not on the agenda 12 months ago, 24 months ago. So the fact that a major economic bloc is thinking in that way, the fact that even despite having Trump in power, there's a lot of progress in the US on renewables, things like that, gives me some hope, and some estimates that China's emissions might peak earlier than they're estimating. They say they'll peak by 2030. Some estimates say it's possible they could peak significantly earlier than that. So if some of these things come together, then I'm optimistic would be scenario 3 is possible.
Thank you. Owen, how fast do we really need to drive down the emissions? You're talking about maybe 4 or 5% just because of the COVID situation, but I mean, how fast do we really need to go down?
The recent estimate, the most recent estimate from the emissions gap report was 7.6% per annum, so about 7 to 8% per annum. Globally, we need to reduce emissions. So that gives you a sense of the scale of things. And of course, richer countries must do much more work, much faster as well, to allow poorer countries to develop.
And the longer we wait, the steeper we have to dive.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, we reckon that 7 to 8% is economically possible. It's a very, very hard push, but it could be done in an economically stable way. When you go beyond that, it becomes more difficult.
Any more questions on the app, Nick?
Well, I just have one question actually myself, which is, where do you think we're on track? In which sectors, and where are we off track? I think of buildings as being way off track, and I think of agriculture. But where are we on track and where are we off track?
Yeah, so the energy sector is in some ways on track. Wind and solar, they're doubling. They're on an exponential trajectory. They're doubling every 3 to 4 years, and that trajectory will take us. If we can keep that up throughout the 2020s, then at least 50% of energy production globally will be from renewables, which is incredible. So this is the power of exponentials, as we're seeing with the coronavirus. How things can spread very, very rapidly, and how watching those curves go up and down. Everybody's now glued to it and thinking about exponentials. Where we're off track, though, is agriculture, for example. I mean, I sense things are changing there. There is more conversations about dietary change. There's more conversations about food waste and the need for sustainable agriculture, but that needs to turn into action in some way, and that's not happening fast enough right now.
Well, thank you very much, Owen Gaffney, for the work you do, for coming here to the studio and giving your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.